Well, hello there. Sorry I haven't seen you in so long. I had a couple of kids. My last one was like 5 weeks ago, which is why I'm not on camera. I am still pretty fat and I am currently just covered in vomit. I'm holding my baby and breastfeeding her right now, so you might hear a few grunts. And here is my cute baby, Annalise. Hopefully that dispels a bit of the image that I just painted. As a new mom, and it was like this with Emmeline as well, most medical professionals that I come into contact with feel the need to tell me about the dangers of co-sleeping. They're like, so where is your baby sleeping?
Where? Where, Dwight?
Seems like you already know where.
Why do they make us lie to them? But I think there are women, mostly first-time moms, getting up in the middle of the night, going to a bassinet or even a separate room and feeding their baby, then leaving them alone, failing to reap the benefits of co-sleeping because some idiot clinician says that sleeping next to their baby can kill them. I guess we should start with the benefits of co-sleeping. I hate to sound like a stupid hippie, but Western child-rearing practices have some really bizarre, inhumane aspects. Although we have graduated from this wet nurse, send your tiny child to boarding school, just British nonsense. Nonetheless, I find this idea that sleeping away from your baby that has only ever known your smell, your touch, and doesn't even have a concept that they're a separate entity from their mom until they're like 6 to 9 months old, to be really, really cruel. You're slipping into unconsciousness. It's scary. I don't even have to do it because I get to sleep next to my husband, and I'm a grown-ass woman. I don't want to sleep alone, and don't even get me started on crying it out. It's totally psychopathic. Anyway, to anyone that isn't a retard, I shouldn't have to provide evidence that co-sleeping has obvious benefits since it is an evolutionary practice, but I will. A few things. I'll try to be brief on these points. It reduces infant stress and improves developmental outcomes in children. The current study examines the links between mother-infant bed sharing at 3 months and infant affect and behavior during a dyadic challenge task at 6 months. Further, we examine nighttime mother-infant contact at 3 months as a possible mechanism that may mediate linkages between bed sharing and infant outcomes. Using observational data from a sample of 63 mother-infant dyads, we found that infants who bed shared for any proportion of the observation period at 3 months displayed significantly more self-regulatory behaviors during the still face episode of the still face paradigm at 6 months compared to non-bed sharing infants. Also, infants of mothers who bed shared for the entire observation period displayed significantly less negativity during the reunion episode than non-bed sharing infants. Additionally, breathing regulation, which has been hypothesized as a cause of SIDS, is also improved with co-sleeping. All right, everyone knows that breastfeeding is best for your child. I will spare you a lecture on this front, so it stands to reason that almost anything that facilitates the duration and frequency of breastfeeding is a positive thing for your baby. Co-sleeping does this. This data was taken during COVID, but I fail to see why it shouldn't be extrapolated to any other period of time. Pregnant adults were asked closed and open-ended questions about their family characteristics, socio-demographic factors, sleeping and breastfeeding habits, and intentions. Bed sharing, odds ratio 2.5, which means it's 2.5 times more likely, and co-sleeping, odds ratio 3.5, intentions doubled and tripled respectively, intentions to breastfeed at 3 months. There was also a significant relationship between intentions to bed share, odds ratio nearly 3, and co-sleep, odds ratio 3.6. with breastfeeding at 6 months. While this is just women's intentions, it shows that women that accept that they'll be co-sleeping are more motivated to breastfeed, and as a result, they do breastfeed more. In this study, 20 bed sharing and 15 solitary sleeping mother-infant pairs were videotaped at night when the infants were 3 to 4 months old. The most important finding is that when tested in their usual sleeping conditions, bed sharing infants breastfed approximately 3 times longer during the night than infants who slept separately. This reflected a 2-fold increase in the number of breastfeeding episodes and 39% longer episodes. Breastfeeding also reduces the risk of SIDS. For the uninitiated, I probably should have started with this, but I can barely remember how to make these videos. SIDS is sudden infant death syndrome. It's a diagnosis of exclusion, the definition being a sudden death of a baby younger than 1 year of age that doesn't have a known cause even after a full investigation. Studies have shown that breastfeeding is associated with a lower risk of SIDS, and the association with SIDS is thought to likely be causal. In their 2011 meta-analysis on breastfeeding and SIDS risk, Hawk proposed possible mechanisms, including increased arousability of the infant and immunoglobulins and cytokines in breast milk that may protect infants during the vulnerable period of SIDS, particularly considering that SIDS is often preceded by a minor infection. Breastfed infants are more easily aroused from active sleep than formula-fed infants at 2 to 3 months of age. Increased brain myelination seen in breastfed infants may affect SIDS risks. These mechanisms are plausible for some deaths, but more evidence is needed. The evidence for a protective association between breastfeeding and SIDS was consistent enough across many observational studies for the American Academy of Pediatrics to recommend human milk feeding in its 2022 guidelines to prevent SIDS. However, it is unclear what aspects of breastfeeding are conferring this protection, if it is breastfeeding or human milk that is responsible. Okay, so we've established that co-sleeping has myriad benefits for child development and that it facilitates breastfeeding, which also reduces the risk of SIDS. But what does the broader data say about the causal relationship between SIDS and co-sleeping? When I first became skeptical about the link, I was thinking about Japan, where most people co-sleep and there's a higher acceptance of the practice. And in Japan, SIDS rates are among the lowest in the entire world. Japan not only has one of the lowest infant mortality rates, fewer than 3 infants per 1,000 live births compared to around 7 in the United States, but one of the lowest SIDS rates in the world, between 0.2 and 0.3 babies per 1,000 live births, compared with approximately 0.5 per 1,000 for the US. The Japan SIDS Family Organization reported that SIDS rates continue to decline in Japan as maternal smoking approaches practically zero and exclusive breastfeeding reaches around 70 to 75%. In fact, one report shows that as bed sharing and breastfeeding increased and as maternal smoking decreased, SIDS rates decreased. Interestingly, it may be that Japanese bed sharing rates do not differ all that much from those in the US, but the cultural acceptance of co-sleeping as the norm is very different. In 1998, 60% of parents said they practiced bed sharing in Japan, only about 16% more than US parents. I believe that the author is correct because if you control for hazardous circumstances, there's robust data that supports that co-sleeping is actually protective against SIDS. This is a really good study with a large cohort. Over a third of SIDS infants were found co-sleeping with an adult at the time of death compared to 15% of control infants. The multivariable risk associated with co-sleeping on a sofa, odds ratio 18.3, or next to a parent who drank more than 2 units of alcohol, odds ratio 18.3, was very high and significant for infants of all ages. The risk associated with co-sleeping next to someone who smoked was significant for infants under 3 months old, odds ratio 8.9, but not for older infants. The multivariable risk associated with bed sharing in the absence of these hazards was not significant overall, odds ratio 1.1, for infants less than 3 months old, odds ratio 1.6, and was in the direction of protection for older infants, odds ratio 0.1. These findings support a public health strategy that underlines specific hazardous co-sleeping environments parents should avoid. Sofa sharing should be avoided, and bed sharing if parents consume alcohol, smoke, take drugs, or if the infant is preterm. Now, why would doctors and the government lie about the cause of SIDS? Or really SIDS existing at all, let's be honest. These lying liars that promoted an untested vaccine that makes your heart explode to supposedly protect against a bioweapon that they engineered. Why would they lie? Okay, I'm going to give most people in the medical establishment the benefit of the doubt. God knows why, since they don't deserve it. But I do think that most pediatricians and even some researchers in the field of sudden infant death syndrome, those that aren't being blackmailed or paid off, are just stupid or are trying to cover their asses. But we cannot discount the more nefarious motivations to attribute certain deaths to less sinister causes. Here's one that no one wants to talk about: people that are just straight up murdering their children. I was hesitant to even mention this because the vast majority of people that have a child who has died of SIDS can attribute the cause to one of the things that we'll discuss in a few minutes. But there is no doubt that some of the SIDS deaths are just murder. Some parents lose their tempers and suffocate their children, then blame it on SIDS, and some see SIDS as an opportunity to cover up premeditated murder. The most famous case of this is that of Juanita Hoyt. This is from a Reddit thread, but it is all true. She has some sources cited if you want to check it out. Just about everyone has heard of SIDS. What most people don't know is SIDS came to the public's attention because a pediatrician ignored warnings that a woman was murdering her own children. Dr. Alfred Steinschneider published an influential case study in the prestigious journal Pediatrics in 1972, which profiled the H family's loss of 5 children during infancy and shortly afterward. Steinschneider proposed a genetic predisposition to sleep apnea. Sleep apnea is a real medical condition where breathing stops and starts during sleep. That wasn't the H family's problem, though. After the death of their 5th child, the father, Tim Hoyt, had a vasectomy because he believed Steinschneider's theory. Steinschneider was a real expert in pediatrics. He was a board-certified pediatrician who held an MD and PhD. The problem was Steinschneider refused to seriously consider what 2 different teams of nurses working on the Hoyt case warned him: when Ada Hoyt was murdering her own children. Steinschneider's paper was later discredited after other researchers' attempts to duplicate his results failed. A forensic pathologist, Dr. Linda Norton, relayed her suspicions to a public prosecutor, William Fitzpatrick. In 1992, Fitzpatrick was elected DA of the county where the Hoyts were living. In 1994, he brought Wineta in for questioning. She confessed in detail to each children's deaths. She had suffocated them in frustration when they were crying. All 5, though, I have a hard time believing these weren't premeditated, but I digress. Hoyt was convicted of murder in 1995 and died in prison 3 years later. An estimated 5% of suspected SIDS cases are infanticide. Steinschneider earned $9 million from the sale of in-home breathing monitors to worried parents of newborns. I suppose we will never know what percentage of SIDS deaths are homicides for obvious reasons. I've linked some research on that below. It's probably somewhere in the ballpark of 1 to 5%. Now the biggie, vaccines. I don't like to outright state that there's causation. It's really difficult to prove, but there is a lot of evidence that vaccines contribute to the rate of SIDS. Let's look at this excellent study, Vaccines and Sudden Infant Death, an analysis of the VAERS database 1990 to 2019, and review of the medical literature. I encourage everyone to read this. It's super informative, and I just cannot cover everything mentioned. A few things I will mention before getting to the VAERS data. The government is aware that vaccination injuries contribute to SIDS, and that's why the American Academy of Pediatrics launched the Back to Sleep campaign, stating that babies sleeping on their stomachs and their sides is the primary cause of SIDS, and encouraging parents to only allow their children to sleep on their backs. This is from the VAERS study. From 1992 through 2001, post-neonatal SIDS declined by an average annual rate of 8.6%. It seemed as though the Back to Sleep campaign was successful and that the real cause of SIDS was due not to vaccinations, but from babies sleeping on their bellies. A closer inspection of the ICD, the 130 official ways for an infant to die, revealed a loophole. Medical certifiers, such as coroners, could choose from among several categories of death when a baby suddenly expired. They didn't have to list the death as SIDS. Although the post-neonatal SIDS rate dropped by an average annual rate of 8.6% from 92 through 2001 following the AAP's seemingly successful Back to Sleep campaign, the post-neonatal mortality rate from suffocation in bed increased during the same period at an average annual rate of 11.2%. Sudden unexplained infant deaths that were classified as SIDS prior to the Back to Sleep campaign were now being classified as deaths due to suffocation in bed. The post-neonatal mortality rate from suffocation other, from unknown and unspecified causes, and from intent unknown all increased during this period as well. In Australia, a similar subterfuge seemed to occur. Researchers observed that when the SIDS rate decreased, deaths attributed to asphyxia increased. Although the post-neonatal SIDS rate continued to decline, there was no significant change in the total post-neonatal mortality rate. The government is so good at cooking the books. VAERS is the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, by the way. Each report includes information about the patient, the vaccines administered, symptoms related to the adverse event, what the outcome was, etc. In the study presented here, the timing and distribution of sudden infant deaths post-vaccination were assessed. If no relationship exists between infant vaccines and sudden infant death, the expectation would be for SIDS cases to be evenly distributed each day rather than clustering in the early post-vaccination period, day 1 through day 7. To test this hypothesis, the VAERS database was analyzed to ascertain the onset interval of infant deaths post-vaccination. There were 2,989 infant deaths reported to VAERS with a vaccination date from 1990 through 2019. Of this total, 2,605, 87%, occurred within 60 days. Males comprised 58% of this population. Females made up 39%. The male-to-female ratio was 60-40 for the cases in which the sex was known. Infants less than 6 months of age comprised 86.5% of all deaths, while the remainder occurred in older infants. Of the 2,605 infant deaths under consideration, a little over 1,000, 40%, were labeled as SIDS, of which 60.5% were male, 37.8% were female. The male-to-female ratio was 61.6 to 38.4% for the cases in which the sex was known. Infants less than 6 months of age comprised nearly 90% of all SIDS cases, while the remainder occurred in older infants. The male to female ratio of SIDS deaths is shocking. I'm convinced that this has some connection with circumcision, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, but let's go through some more of this analysis first. Of the 2,605 infant deaths, 58% clustered within 3 days post-vaccination and 78.3% within 7 days post-vaccination. The remaining deaths occurred between 8 and 60 days post-vaccination, an average of 11 per day, 564 over 53 days, as compared to 760 infant deaths that occurred on day 2 post-vaccination, a 69-fold increase. If the 2,605 deaths which occurred within 60 days of vaccination were randomly distributed throughout this interval, one would expect 43 deaths per day, or 304 per week. The excess of deaths on the day of vaccination, 43 were expected, 440 occurred. Within 3 days post-vaccination, 130 were expected, 1,512 occurred. And in the first week post-vaccination, 304 were expected, 2,041 occurred. Were all statistically significant. Of the 1,048 SIDS cases, 51% clustered within 3 days post-vaccination and 75.5% within 7 days post-vaccination. The remaining SIDS cases occurred between 8 days and 60 days post-vaccination, an average of 4.8 per day, 257 over 53 days, as compared to 277 SIDS cases that occurred on day 2 post-vaccination, a 57-fold increase. If the 1,048 SIDS cases which occurred within 60 days of vaccination were randomly distributed throughout this interval, one would expect 17.5 SIDS cases per day, or 122 per week. The excess of SIDS cases on the day of vaccination, 17 were expected, 131 occurred. Within 3 days post-vaccination, 52 expected, 534 occurred. And in the first week post-vaccination, 122 expected, 791 occurred. Were all statistically significant. Since infant deaths were not all being attributed to SIDS, so that the causal relationship with vaccines was more difficult to establish in research, it was really helpful that this author analyzed total infant deaths and SIDS deaths. The relationship of excess deaths in the immediate post-vaccination period still persisted. The findings in the study revealed that infant death and SIDS cases were not randomly distributed each day. Instead, infant mortality and SIDS cases reported to VAERS tended to occur in temporal proximity to vaccine administration. That is, they clustered in the early post-vaccination period, day 1 through day 7. Excess deaths were significantly greater than expected. Several theories regarding the pathogenic mechanism behind these fatal events have been proposed. According to Douglas Miller, a neuropathologist and expert witness on SIDS, vaccines evoke the production of cytokines that can produce fever and inhibit the activity of 5-HT neurons in the medulla, causing prolonged apneas and interference with autoresuscitation. Maturi hypothesized that aluminum adjuvants in vaccines cross the blood-brain barrier, inducing neuronal molecular alterations in DNA, RNA, and proteins of brainstem neurons regulating vital functions, with consequent fatal disorganization of respiratory control in predisposed infants. Miller and Goldman suggested the potential for biochemical or synergistic toxicity due to multiple vaccines administered concurrently. Within both of the analyses, all mortality and SIDS, approximately 60% of the victims were male. This is consistent with findings in other studies on SIDS throughout the world. Some evidence suggests that males are more susceptible to infant deaths because they are more likely to be delivered prematurely. Infant mortality in preterm babies is more likely in males, and deaths occurring secondary to respiratory distress syndrome in preterm babies are more prevalent in males. Moscovitz suggests that an increase in testosterone in male infants could be affecting dysregulation of the inflammatory responses to apparently mild infections, contributing to the higher proportion of male SIDS victims. Kinney observed that SIDS may be more common in males because in the situation with the defective medullary 5-HT system, they may be less capable of responding to the accumulation of carbon dioxide during sleep. I feel like I did not do this research justice. There are several more sections with past and current research supporting the theory that vaccines are a serious contributing factor to SIDS and to total infant death rate. Please check out that information in the link below. As far as the skewed male to female ratio of SIDS deaths goes, another compelling theory is that circumcision is a contributory factor, particularly in concomitant cases of prematurity. This study looked at that relationship and SIDS. SIDS mortality rate was significantly and positively correlated with male neonatal circumcision. Globally weighted, increase of 0.06 per 1,000 SIDS mortality per 10% increase in circumcision rate. US weighted, increase of zero point 0.1 per 1,000 unexplained mortality per 10% increase in circumcision rate. U.S. states in which Medicaid covers circumcision had significantly higher circumcision rates and male to female ratio of SIDS deaths than other U.S. states. Prematurity was also significantly and positively correlated with circumcision. Globally, increase of 0.5 per 1,000 SIDS mortality per 10% increase in the prematurity rates. U.S. increase of 1.9 per 1,000 unexplained mortalities per 10% increase in the prematurity rates. Combined, the phenotypes increase the likelihood of SIDS. There are some other suggested causes of SIDS that are quite compelling as well. Since it is a diagnosis of exclusion, I think it is almost certain that the cause is multifactorial. Infant botulism has been found in up to 20% of SIDS cases. And new research using dried blood spots of SIDS babies presents strong evidence that there is at least some contribution from altered genetic enzyme activity. Of course, suffocation itself, as we discussed earlier, is also a factor. Most of these cases seem to be women and men who are intoxicated, morbidly obese, or are on drugs. Smoking is well likely due to carbon monoxide. No matter, it is not true that out of exhaustion, women that are co-sleeping are rolling over and killing their babies. How on earth would we have survived as a species if this were the case? In fact, women are biologically hardwired to sleep more lightly, to be in tune with the nighttime needs of their babies. I really spurred out on this one. Sorry it was so long. It just pisses me off that mothers and babies are separated from one another so that the government and doctors can lie to scared women that are afraid of their kids dying suddenly in the night, just so that they can push vaccine initiatives, continue to encourage parents to circumcise despite there being no scientific basis of its benefit, and let drunk, fat people off the hook for rolling over on their babies. If you're a new mom, you go ahead and sleep next to your baby. Just be safe. Don't have heavy blankets, extra pillows. Use common sense. But you aren't going to kill your child in the night. You are not a danger to your child. You protect your children from danger with your very presence, even if you're sleeping. Babies need you when they're sleeping. They need to know that you're nearby and hear you breathe and feel your warmth. This whole thing is an anti-family psyop, and I hope I dispelled some of the myths associated with SIDS and reduced some new parent fear surrounding it. SIDS does not exist. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll be back with another super in-depth video on a random topic that nobody asked for in a few days, a few weeks. Who am I kidding? I'll be back at some unspecified point in the future. As always, links below if you want to throw some money, even though I rarely work. If you want to look at the references that I use, it's all below. Thank you so much for watching again, and goodbye.